Spider-Man 3, a novelization by Peter David. Based upon the screenplay by Alvin Sargent and the screen story by Sam Raimi and Ivan Raimi. Based on the Marvel comic book by Stan Lee and Steve Ditko. Prologue. Peter Parker does not believe that old notion that, when one is about to die, one's life flashes before one's eyes. He considers it a sort of after-the-fact add-on. Someone has a near-death experience and, in recalling it, mentally inserts all the highlights of his existence after the fact, as a sort of mental counterpoint to life's near termination. Memory, after all, is a tricky thing, possibly the most deceptive aspect of the brain's function. The main reason Peter has come to be dismissive of the concept is because, in his activities as Spider-Man, he has been near death more times than he can count. More times, in fact, than any reasonable person should have to experience. In all those times, all those close shaves, he has never once seen his life go flashing before his eyes. Not when the Green Goblin had him on the ropes, his uniform tattered and his last dregs of energy seemingly used up. Not when Otto Octavius had him in a stranglehold while Ock's fearsome machine sped on a particle acceleration toward destroying the entire city. Not once during the myriad encounters with various petty crooks, bank robbers, muggers, and gunmen. Never. Not even close to it. This time, however, it's different. At this moment, as Peter thrashes his arms and legs about in midair, a good 50 stories above the cold and unforgiving streets of New York, the recent developments in his life rip through his skull, like a projector unspooling from somewhere deep in his cerebral cortex and projecting a picture on his retinas. He hears his own voice speaking. It sounds distant, calm, as if he has managed to detach himself completely from his current predicament. He does not currently see the night, nor feel the chill of the stiff wind in his bones, but instead sees the sun creeping up over the East River. This is a day seen at its beginning, filled with promise and hope, not a day ending in sorrow and death. What a day, Peter's chipper voice tells him. Inwardly, soundlessly, he laughs bitterly over the irony of such short-sightedness. Well, anyway, there's a fresh breeze. The sun gives way to the spider symbol that typically rests upon his chest. Nevertheless, it is not his symbol, or at least not his chest. He sees a boy, a young boy, clambering up a high tree limb in Central Park. Peter is standing a few feet away, cutting through the park, but pausing to take in the amazing sight of a boy pretending to be not a cowboy or a robber or ninja or pirate, but instead Peter himself. More correctly, Peter's alter ego, for the boy is sporting a crudely stitched facsimile of Peter's costume shirt. It reminds Peter a bit of the makeshift costume he'd first worn when he'd embarked on his short-lived wrestling career. Then the higher branch abruptly snaps in the boy's hand. Peter senses it just before it happens, and he is already moving to intercept the boy's plunge. He is not the only one, as it turns out, who is keeping an eye on the lad and is in possession of a hyper-awareness of danger. The boy falls, and suddenly his mother is there, deftly snagging him before he hits the ground, faster than even Peter could have gotten over there. She rights him and scolds him. "No more climbing up there! You're not Spider-Man!" The boy retorts, "Am too!" With that defiant declaration, he starts right back toward the tree. The mother lets out a long-suffering sigh of infinite patience, and a smiling Peter turns away, confident the kid's safety is in good hands. As he turns, the scenery shifts around him once more, as it is capable of doing since all this is flashing through his mind between beats of his heart. Rather than being land-bound, he is soaring over the city. He had been halting and uncertain in his earliest days of web-slinging, careening off buildings through mistimed leaps and swings. Now he switches hands deftly, left and right, arcing through the concrete mazes of Manhattan with an ease that is literally lyrical, since there are no less than 3 songs about him by various artists in the Billboard Top 100. The city is safe and sound. I guess I had something to do with that. It is a modest thought, and a false modesty at that. There is no guess about it, especially when one considers that the giant video screen in Times Square has the words NYC Heart Spider-Man rolling across it. It is a true out-of-body experience because Peter is not, in fact, in his costume and swinging among the spires in Times Square. Instead, he is watching himself on the giant video screen. The image of Spider-Man web-slinging across Manhattan is playing out above the Spidey adoration text, part of a video advertisement that has been purchased by the New York City Tourism Board. With everything that the city has been through in the past several years, they're anxious to do whatever can be done to reassure visitors to the Big Apple that they can feel safe. And they have chosen Spider-Man to be the symbol of that safety. Peter stands in Times Square, watching the video, thinking that his Uncle Ben would have been proud. Tourists who had been watching the video start to walk away at its conclusion, and Peter calls out, "It's gonna start again in a couple minutes." They spare him a puzzled glance, and then go on about their business. He supposes they have the right idea. He should be on about his business as well. He slings his backpack over his shoulder, and the world shifts around him once more. And I still get to school, top of my class. Dr. Curtis Connors is lecturing his students. Peter is listening attentively. Once, not long ago, he would have felt so torn, so conflicted over his double life, that he would have been unable to concentrate on anything his favorite science professor was saying. That's no longer the case because of, wait for it, take your time, let it all unfold in order. That's how it's done. The Hamiltonian shows us that the energy levels are perturbed by the electric field. Dr. Connors tells them, tapping a complex set of equations and graphs on the board. From the form of this matrix, we can see... He pauses, looking for the answer. Peter's hand shoots up. Connors points in Peter's general direction, and Peter is about to open his mouth and respond when Connors says, "Miss Stacy?" "That only the m=0 quantum states are affected." "Correct. Good work, Miss Stacy." Peter looks toward his lab partner, Gwen Stacy. She is a vivacious, attractive blonde, her long hair cascading around her shoulders. Paired off by luck of the draw as partners, they had promptly hit it off. She had recognized his name immediately. It turned out her father was a police captain who had been the first on the scene after Uncle Ben had been murdered. He told his daughter all about the grief-stricken youth who had been there, cradling his uncle as the old man had passed away. And Gwen admitted she had been moved to tears by the telling of it. Consequently, Peter had found Gwen easy to talk to and a good listener. He almost thinks she'd be a good match for Harry Osborn. But Gwen is in a tangled relationship with some guy, and now isn't the time. Besides, it's not as if he could set up something with Harry even if Gwen were available. He sees himself riding his motorbike through the long shadows of the city. All that's missing is my relationship with Harry. I need to explain to him how his father died, but he won't see me. He is standing in the reception area of Oscorp, pleading with a sympathetic receptionist to give him 10 minutes. Make it 5. Make it 1 minute of Harry's time. She just sadly shakes her head. This isn't the first time he's been here, and likely won't be the last. He could simply scale the side of the building, clamber in through Harry's window. What would be the point, though? Harry would just start screaming at him and insist that he leave. He can't force himself on Harry. He can't cram down young Osborn's throat the fact that his father was the demented Green Goblin and died because of his own machinations rather than anything Peter had done. Harry has to willingly accept him into his office or home. He has to be prepared to listen. Until that time, attempts to get through to him are doomed to failure. There is no point in pressing the matter or obsessing over it. Life goes on. Does it? For you? For much longer? Peter is no longer at Oscorp. Instead, he is hurrying down the street, dressed in a sharp gray suit. It is dusk. He passes a pawn shop, then stops and backs up. Something in the window having caught his eye. It is a wedding ring, the gold band glittering in the twilight. It is small and modest, but it would convey the thought and intent quite well. If one did not know by the smile on his face and the spring in his step that Peter Parker was a man in love, his gazing at the ring would certainly have been the tip-off. Would you believe it? I finally got the girl of my dreams. She, of course, is the reason that everything else in his life is working. She provides the light that chases away the darkness that had settled upon his soul the day Ben Parker died. Without her, nothing works. With her, everything in his life runs with the precision of an atomic clock. He had almost lost her to another man. Through his indecision and inaction, he had nearly allowed her to slip away. But after all the times that he had saved Mary Jane Watson, finally, Mary Jane Watson had saved him. She had shown up in the nick of time, clad in her own unusual costume. Not gaudy red and blue, but instead a wedding dress, having fled the church to find Peter and let him know that she would be there for him, always. And there had been Peter, trapped in endless night, looking into the face of the sun and feeling the warmth. That was months ago. Just as Peter's life had straightened itself out, so has Mary Jane's. No longer a struggling actress, MJ is now headlining a new musical, Manhattan Memories, playing at the Broadburst Theater. Alright, technically not headlining. Two other actors named Linda Curtis and Solomon Abrams are billed above her. But she is there in the poster, dead center, and Peter could not be more proud, or more in love, or more punctual. Oh yes, punctual. The memory of when he'd arrived late for her previous production, and been kept in the lobby by a supercilious usher, was still far too fresh for him. Nowadays, he makes certain to arrive a half hour before curtain. He moves to his front row seat and waits. Even though this is all recollection, even though it's all happening in a flash while a demented cackling is filtering dimly through his subconscious, it still feels as if it were taking forever. Finally, the orchestra finishes tuning up and launches into the overture. The music swells, and the thin, red velvet curtain parts. Manhattan Memories is intended to be a love letter to the musicals of yore. None of the songs are new. Cole Porter, the Gershwins, many of the famous tunesmiths of time gone past, all represented and with their songs strung together via a new book that is, Peter has to admit, a little flimsy. He'd had the time to make that assessment since he'd been to half a dozen of the show's performances while it was in previews. He decided that it didn't matter all that much. After all, who leaves a musical humming the script? It was all about the songs. And in that regard, the show was rock solid. Tonight, though, is not a preview. Tonight is opening night. There is an additional charge in the air, an intensity that had not been present at any of the earlier shows. This is the make or break, the one that counts. It's as if the entirety of Broadway is somehow spiritually poised, like a lion in the high weeds, waiting to see if the show will join the pride or instead become prey for the jackals, i.e. critics. There is a collective murmur of approval from the audience as the opening curtains reveal a vista of stars hanging in the heavens. But the approval is not merely for the scenery. It is largely for the gorgeous redhead who appears to be standing on air, like an angel gazing upon earthbound mortals. Unless one is looking carefully, it is impossible to see the wafer-thin platform on which she is situated, or the narrow series of steps that lead down. It's an effective illusion. She is clad in a long, flowing blue dress, her red hair piled elegantly atop her head. Helen of Troy may have had the face that launched 1,000 ships, but Mary Jane's smile alone should be good enough to launch 1,000 performances. Mary Jane starts down the stairs, every foot carefully placed. She'd stumbled on the first day of previews and almost taken a header down them. She'd learned her lesson that night about hurrying. She begins to sing. And although she should really be directing her efforts toward the back of the theater, she cheats and instead gazes directly and lovingly at Peter. He's not entirely thrilled with the quality of the sound system. It's making MJ's voice sound reedy and thinner than it should be. That doesn't matter, though. Her mere presence is magical. Certainly everyone will realize that and ignore such minor technical glitches. Reality and fantasy begin to blend, the barrier between them breaking down. Peter is no longer in his seat. He is floating out of it, reaching toward Mary Jane. She stretches her hands toward him, laughing gaily, and then he is above her. This isn't happening. That part never happened. Cool air rushes against his face. He can still see the balcony from where he is, and from this vantage point, he notices someone watching him through a pair of opera glasses. The watcher lowers the glasses and glares balefully at Peter. Alright, that part did happen. He was there. And afterward, Peter feels a jolt. The glittering stars are still around him, but the theater is gone. Mary Jane is gone. He is hanging, suspended. One of the stars breaks away, tumbles toward him, and he sees that it's a diamond engagement ring. Gravity is suddenly making its presence known. It's not happening all at once, more by degrees, like with the coyote in those cartoons. The more he becomes aware of his predicament, the more gravity stakes a claim on him. He tries to defy it. He stretches, strains, the tumbling ring just out of reach, and then he is falling. Except not straight down. Instead, he's falling sideways, as if something has propelled him. And then he slams into the wall of a building. He does so with such velocity that he's not able to get a grip on it, and he tumbles away from it. "Harry! Harry, wait!" Peter cries, which might well serve as his last words, but they're not. He said them before, and Harry is turning and glaring at him. The time before and the time right now crashing together, floating above the then and the now, and quite possibly all that is to come is a high-pitched, demented laugh that sounds both familiar and unfamiliar. And then consciousness slips away, and Peter's life review ends prematurely, as the stars coldly glitter around him like diamonds while he plunges toward his death. And nothing is as it should be. 1. Arrivals and departures. "Harry! Harry, wait!" Peter hadn't believed for a moment that Harry Osborn would miss the opening of Mary Jane's show. Despite all that had happened between them, and all that remained unresolved, the bottom line was that Harry still had to feel something for Mary Jane. She had been his first major love, had been too much of a part of his life for him to let such a landmark event pass. Hell, Harry had attended MJ's previous theatrical endeavor 4 times, a fact that Mary Jane had pointedly made clear to Peter, back when he'd been so unable to manage his time that he'd alienated her by missing performance after performance. Still, Peter hadn't seen Harry in the theater. Now he realized why. Peter had naturally assumed that, considering Harry's wealth, he would have obtained the best seats in the house. Instead, as Peter made his way up the aisle, he spotted Harry coming down the stairs that led to the balcony. Harry had obviously wanted to see without being seen. Just as Harry reached the bottom of the stairs, some instinct caused him to glance Peter's way. For half a moment, they locked eyes. And then Harry pushed his way past several people in front of him. He nearly knocked an old woman off her walker as she was busy extolling the virtues of Cole Porter and wondering loudly why they didn't write tunes like that anymore. When Harry shoved her aside, she surprised Harry, Peter, and the people she was with by snapping out an extremely explicit profanity at him. Harry blinked in surprise, and then moved away from her. He was out the door, and Peter found his way blocked by the same elderly people. He looked around desperately, spotted an opening on the upper section of the wall next to them, and prayed no one was watching too closely. With one quick move, he jumped 6 feet in the air, rebounded with his feet off the wall, and landed in front of the slow-moving party. Their heads snapped around in confusion, since Peter had been little more than a blur in the corners of their eyes. By the time they had any real inkling of where he'd been, he was already gone and out the front door of the theater. Peter got there just in time to see Harry stepping into the back seat of his town car. The chauffeur was standing there, waiting for Harry, holding the door for him. "Harry! Harry, wait!" Peter called as the chauffeur slammed the door closed. Peter looked at Harry's driver, and to his surprise, something akin to sympathy was there. It underscored for Peter that Harry's staff had to be aware of the slow deterioration of their employer's personality. They must have felt, in their own way, as helpless as Peter. Probably worse, since a number of them had served the Osborns for many years and had known Harry since he was very young. "How many people are you going to hurt, Harry? What's it going to take before you let me in?" Peter brought his face close to the window as the chauffeur headed for the driver's side. The window was tinted, but Peter could still make out Harry on the inside looking out at him. "Don't keep locking me out. You need to hear the truth." Peter couldn't be sure, but he thought that something in Harry's expression just then seemed to be wavering. It was as if he wanted to hear what Peter had to say, but couldn't bring himself to do so. Or perhaps there was even more to it than that. Then Harry's gaze shifted. It was the strangest thing, but it looked to Peter as if Harry was staring intently at his own reflection. He had no idea why Harry would possibly do that. A change passed over Harry's face then, and whatever curiosity or compassion or even consideration might have been in his expression moments earlier was now replaced by distance and harshness. The window rolled down barely half an inch, just enough so that Harry could be sure that his voice was heard. "Tell it to my father," he said coldly. "Raise him from the dead." "I'm your friend, Harry," Peter said desperately. "Your father was my friend." That might have seemed insane to say, at least on the surface, but as far as Peter was concerned, it was the truth. Norman Osborn had been helpful and supportive to Peter. Sometimes it seemed even more than he was with his own son, an inequity that Harry had appeared to take in stride. That was the person whom Peter thought of as Norman Osborn, not the crazed, cackling, flying demon into which circumstance and accident had transformed him. The real Norman Osborn, Peter's friend and Harry's dad, died the day the Green Goblin was born. Everything else after that had been the unfolding of a Greek tragedy. The window slid back up, and seconds later the car pulled away from the curb. Peter could have run after it. For that matter, he could have leapt atop the roof and clung to it. He could have webbed it to the spot, preventing it from moving forward. But what good would any of that have done? Just what Peter would have needed. Harry leaping out of the car and screaming at him that he, Spider-Man, had killed his father. So much for his secret identity. As he sighed heavily and headed around to the stage door entrance, where the stage manager knew him well and would let him pass with no problem, Peter had to wonder why he even had a secret identity anymore. What in the world had stopped Harry from telling the police, or J. Jonah Jameson, or taking out a billboard? What prevented him, in short, from blabbing Peter's secret to the world? 3 reasons occurred to him. The first was that, on some level, Harry knew that not all was as it seemed with his father's passing. Perhaps Harry had even figured out that his father was the Green Goblin. If the truth of Peter's identity came out, then sooner or later that truth would lead to the revelation that Norman Osborn was the Goblin. The sins of the father would be laid at the feet of the son. Not only would Norman's legacy be forever disgraced, but anyone who had suffered damage at the hands of Norman Osborn might turn around and sue his estate. Harry could be wiped out. Second, Harry would logically be asked how he knew the secret of Spider-Man's identity. What would Harry say to that? I hired the known criminal, Dr. Octopus, to assault Spider-Man, kidnap him, and bring him into me so that I could unmask him? Not only would he then be exposed to even more civil suits from the damage that Doc Ock had done at his behest, but he would also face criminal and felony charges. Harry could bring Peter down, but Harry would go down right alongside him. Then there was the third, least appealing reason. If Peter's identity became public knowledge, it would be the equivalent of painting a target on his back. He'd never have a moment's rest. Anyone who'd ever hated Spider-Man would come gunning for Peter, and sooner or later, they'd get him. Even Peter Parker had to sleep eventually. He'd be a dead man for certain. Why wouldn't that suit Harry Osborn, who so despised his former friend? The answer was obvious. Harry wanted to save the privilege of killing Peter for himself. Oh yeah, that's making me feel a whole lot better. It required great effort on his part, but Peter was determined to put all such thoughts out of his mind. This was Mary Jane's night, her evening to shine, and he'd be damned if he would drag her down with his depressing musings. It was a madhouse backstage. The narrow corridors were packed with well-wishers and fans. People were thrusting their playbill programs at whatever cast members they could find, and the actors were reveling in it. Peter noticed some good-looking man clad in a suit also signing an autograph. He wasn't a cast member. Peter assumed he was someone famous. Hard to say for sure who it was. Peter wasn't especially good at identifying actors. He saw Mary Jane back up and pause in the entrance to her dressing room. She was clearly studying the crowd, looking for, he hoped, him. "MJ!" he called, and immediately she turned and spotted him. Her face split with a grin. "Peter!" Then, just as quickly, her expression transformed into concern bordering on agitation. As he approached her, he wondered what could be wrong. Had she seen Harry? Were the same worries that Peter had been occurring to MJ as well? She gripped him by the shoulders, and, as if asking a doctor whether the tumor was malignant or not, demanded, "Was I good?" It was all he could do not to laugh. It was ludicrous that she'd even have to ask. "Good? You were great. You're just... How can I say it? You said great." She reminded him as if she were an auctioneer making certain that he was sticking to his previous high bid. He smiled and nodded in reaffirmation, and she pulled him into the dressing room, leaving the door open behind him. He immediately saw the simple, tasteful assortment of flowers that he had sent, sitting on a table nearby. But they were dwarfed by another arrangement so ostentatious that it might have looked at home atop the coffin of a dead princess. MJ had to push past them to rest a hand on the flowers that Peter had sent. "I got your flowers, thank you. They're beautiful. And these... They're from Harry," he thought grimly without even having to be told. "Are from Harry," Mary Jane finished. She looked confused, glancing over Peter's shoulder as if she expected Harry to be walking in right behind him. "Was he here tonight?" "I saw him, but..." Peter paused, not wanting to say too much, but not wanting to say so little that it was obvious he was holding back. "He wouldn't talk to me." Peter tried not to introduce any melancholy into the moment, but there it was anyway. MJ's face fell as she said, "I'm so sorry. What is it with you guys, anyway?" Well, his father was the Green Goblin, and Harry thinks I killed him, and... It's complicated, he said with an air of finality, hoping that MJ wouldn't pursue it. His wish was granted. It wasn't all that surprising. Ultimately, Mary Jane was an actress on opening night of her play, and her thoughts weren't going to wander far from the performance for long. "Tell me again, did you really like it?" she asked, all concerns about Harry forgotten. She laughed, although it was a laugh tainted with an edge. "I was so nervous, my knees were shaking." "Your knees were fine," he assured her. Clearly, she still had doubts. The applause wasn't very loud. Peter had noticed the same thing, but he had an answer at the ready that he had even managed to convince himself was completely true. "Yes, it was," he said quickly. Perhaps too quickly, but she didn't notice. "Well, it's the acoustics. It's all about diffusion, which keeps the sound waves from grouping." Mary Jane didn't look entirely convinced, so he spoke faster, random technical words spilling over each other in a suicidal rush, like lemmings. "It's all about slap and flutter and nulls and hot spots." Mercifully, the celebrity that Peter had spotted earlier drew MJ's attention away from Peter. He was walking past the open door of the dressing room, and he saw that MJ had noticed him. There was a brief silence, which Peter might have considered uncomfortable if he hadn't been distracted by the hopeful look on Mary Jane's face. The celebrity cleared his throat and said just a little stiffly, "Congratulations, my dear. You were quite good." As he walked away, MJ clapped her hands together in delight. "Peter!" she almost squealed. "Do you know who that was?" No. He was looking forward to finally learning for certain. But Mary Jane was clearly enraptured, lost in her own little world of sudden notoriety. "He won a Tony Award! He liked me!" "I thought that was him," Peter said, as if that settled it. She grinned so widely that, had New York suffered another blackout, her smile would have illuminated the room. "I think I'm happy," she announced. "Let's celebrate." "Got my bike." The traffic out of the city had been formidable, but Peter had deftly maneuvered his motorbike between the lines of traffic that were stacked up in the Lincoln Tunnel. His natural agility helped him keep it steady no matter how hair-raising the maneuvers. Mary Jane clung to his back the entire time, her warmth suffusing him, and she got to burbling about the play. With the helmet over his head, he couldn't hear half of what she was saying, but it didn't matter. All he had to do was nod and say yeah, or that's great, or just laugh loudly ever so often, and that was sufficient. Soon the city had been left far behind. He drove them up to the Palisades, to a beautiful section of the woods where his Uncle Ben had used to take him when he was very young. It was a terrific place for stargazing, a pastime that was hard to indulge in the city, where the lights made quality viewing difficult. Up in the Palisades, overlooking the Hudson River, the view was unimpeded. Peter thought with amusement that it was almost up to the level of the fake stars that had dotted the Broadway stage where MJ had made her debut. To top it all off, a spectacular meteor shower was underway, dazzling streaks of light zipping within and around the constellations. The ground was a bit damp, making lying down there problematic. Peter was unfazed. He rolled up his sleeves, exposing the spinnerets on his forearms, and in short order had fashioned a web hammock between two large trees. With his bike parked nearby, he and Mary Jane lay in the hammock, swaying gently in the breeze, gazing up rapturously at the array of stars and the meteor shower overhead. He was busy imagining Mary Jane descending from the stars above on an invisible staircase, when she spoke with an air of wonderment. "Where do they all come from?" "Maybe Mars, 100 million years ago," he replied carelessly. He could have given her a detailed dissertation on the falling space rocks burning up in the atmosphere, and on the Big Bang and the forces that had created a billion balls of gas, but he didn't really think she was that interested. Once again he had sussed her out correctly. "You know what?" she said. "I'd like to sing on the stage for the rest of my life, with you in the first row. I'll be there." He gestured toward the heavens, as if an earthbound stage were simply insufficient to contain her talent. I'm going to build you a stage on the Milky Way. She laughed. Can you swing that high? She asked teasingly. I'm working on it. Mary Jane paused, and then, her voice dropping low and becoming filled with intense need, she said, Tell me you love me. I like to hear it. It makes me feel safe. He turned slightly, so that he was looking into her eyes, their faces only a few inches apart. I will always love you, Mary Jane. I always have. Their lips came together. Strawberry, he murmured. For a second, Peter noticed something flashing high in the sky. Another meteor, this one very close. Shooting stars. Heralds of great changes to come for anyone who witnessed them. Then he put such unscientific thoughts out of his mind, and focused his attention instead on the woman he loved. The shooting star that Peter had observed, speculated about, and then given no further thought to, thudded to earth in a nearby field. A small, smoking crater provided evidence of where precisely it had struck. Had Peter endeavored to turn his analytical eye upon the aftermath of the space rock's fall, he would have seen something that defied any manner of scientific explanation. It was a thick, black, gooey substance, which oozed from the meteorite's porous surface, as if the space rock were a car, and the hard landing had caused an oil leak. To describe the behavior of something from space as unearthly would certainly seem, on the face of it, to be belaboring the obvious. Nevertheless, it would have been warranted in the case of the black substance, for it now wasn't merely oozing from the rock. Instead, it was as if it was pulling itself, extracting itself consciously from the meteorite. The black goo separated from the meteorite entirely, and sat there for a moment, an animated puddle getting its bearings. Then it started across the field, propelling itself a few feet, halting as if trying to orient itself and acquire a sense of its surroundings, then undulating forward once more. Then it reacted to something, some sort of growling noise. Even though it was a newcomer to the planet, it could still differentiate between a sound made in nature and something that was technological. It sped toward the source, eager to see what this world had to offer. It was impossible to determine whether the black goo was some sort of higher species of individual with a refined thought process, or some sort of animalistic thing operating purely on instinct. Either way, the result was the same. Its rapid slither brought it within distance of what appeared to be two biological forms, possibly native to the sphere, perched atop something perhaps designed to transport them. It scrutinized the both of them, and was immediately drawn to one over the other. The one on the front of the vehicle. The one who radiated power and energy. The creature was no more than a few inches in diameter, so it wasn't noticed at all as it slithered up onto Peter Parker's shoe when his foot shoved down on the starter once more. This time, the engine caught and the bike rolled forward. The abrupt movement gave the creature a brief moment of disorientation. It clung fiercely to the underside of Peter's shoe and settled in, basking in the power that Peter's molecular structure was generating. With Mary Jane holding tight, her hair whipping about in the wind, Peter maneuvered the motorbike down onto the road toward New York City, unaware that the city was under alien invasion, and equally unaware that he was the means by which it was happening. 2. Fathers. When Harry Osborn had seen the desperate face of Peter Parker peering in through the window of the town car, something about the intensity of his sincerity had almost prompted Harry to listen. For a moment, he saw Peter not as the enemy who had destroyed his father, or the rival who had snatched Mary Jane away from him. Instead, he was the whiz kid who had taken a young Harry under his wing and had helped him succeed in high school science classes, an accomplishment that at least half a dozen tutors had sworn to Harry's father was an impossibility. Peter had seen hope when others had declared Harry to be hopeless. Unlike just about everyone else in Harry's life, Peter had been under no obligation to do so. Norman Osborn didn't own him, didn't pay him, couldn't compel him. Peter had just done it out of the goodness of his heart, because he thought Harry was a decent guy who could use a friend. That was the man who was standing there at curbside, begging Harry to listen to him. What would it hurt? Really? Giving him 5 minutes to explain his side of the story? Harry was pretty sharp and could usually tell when someone was lying to him. If Peter tried to feed Harry some sort of bull, Harry would know. Harry would... Don't weaken. Harry couldn't tell if the voice was sounding in his head or was in his car with him. But the identity of the speaker was unmistakable. Harry was staring at the window, but it was not his own reflection he saw, or even Peter's image through the glass. Instead, it was the face of his father, Norman Osborn, glowering at him. Don't weaken. Norman Osborn, who had thought so little of Harry during much of his life, was now counting on Harry to be strong, to remain focused and not lose sight of what had to be done, and to whom it had to be done. Lowering the window slightly, feeling as if an invisible hand were upon his throat, Harry said, "Tell it to my father. Raise him from the dead." He rolled the window back up, ignoring everything else Peter was saying, then leaned forward and rapped on the privacy partition that separated him from the driver. The car rolled away from the curb, leaving a frustrated Peter Parker in its wake. "Good job, Harry. You had me going there. For a minute I thought you were going to listen to my murderer." Harry said nothing. Instead, he put his hands to the side of his head as if battling a migraine. His father continued speaking to him, whispering into his ear, inside his brain. He saw Norman's image in the privacy partition. Harry had spent months wondering if he was going out of his mind. Then one day, he'd stopped caring. He'd simply accepted this condition as his new status quo. He was to spend the rest of his life being haunted, like Hamlet, urged by the ghost of his father to exact revenge on those who were responsible for his death. There were 2 problems with that. First, he didn't know how to go about it. And second, he knew exactly how to go about it, and was simply daunted by the prospect. Bernard, the stately family retainer, came to Harry, unbidden, as the young Osborn sat in his study, staring at the wall. Bernard was carrying a glass of warm milk, and said gently, "I thought this might help you sleep, Mr. Osborn. You've been up until all hours lately, and I was becoming concerned." Harry barely afforded him a glance. "No thanks. Could you go now, please?" "I thought there might be something else." A sudden burst of rage seized Harry. "I'm not a child, all right, Bernard? I don't need your concern. I don't need your damned milk." With a sweep of his hand, he knocked the glass off the table, sending it clattering to the floor. The milk splattered and the glass shattered. Harry's immediate impulse was to apologize, to offer to clean it up. But instead, he closed his eyes and let his head sag back against the chair. He didn't know how much time passed. All he knew was that, when he opened his eyes once more, Bernard was gone, and so were any traces of the mess he'd just made. Harry began to wonder if Bernard had even been there at all. Maybe Harry's father wasn't there either. Hell, perhaps even Harry wasn't really there. That would explain everything, wouldn't it? The night that he had learned Peter Parker's other identity, the night that he discovered his best friend was responsible for the death of his father, Harry had stood upon his balcony and contemplated throwing himself to the street below, rather than live with the unwanted knowledge. His recollection was that he had not done so, but perhaps he had. Perhaps all of this was just a wild fantasy, a last burst of synapses firing before his body struck the sidewalk, and his tormented existence was terminated. Don't think that way, Harry. You have a destiny. You have a job to do. Oh, God, moaned Harry, rubbing his temples. He didn't want to see his father's reflection again. Sometimes days would go by during which he'd see and hear nothing untoward, and he'd think that finally, oh thank God, it was over. Then his father would show up unexpectedly, and it was off to the races once more. He'd never forget the time that Norman had appeared in his mirror one morning while he was shaving. Harry had almost slit his own throat. Perhaps that might have been a blessing. Harry, it's time. Look at me, son. Slowly, Harry forced his eyes to open. For the life of him, he couldn't have said whether he was dreaming. Norman Osborn was standing in front of him, no longer reflected in a surface, but instead as big as life. He might well have strolled through the door and sat down, ready for a chat. His mouth was moving, but his voice was slightly out of sync, like a badly dubbed film. I've been waiting for you to be ready. I now believe you are. Ready for what? Harry whispered. To avenge me, Norman said, with a trace of surprise, as if it were stunningly self-evident. Against Parker. Against all of them that took me away from you. But Peter is the sickness, Norman told him heartedly. And you are the cure for that sickness. Then his tone shifted, becoming more cajoling, even sympathetic. Don't you remember, Harry? I'd finally come to appreciate you for the loving, loyal son that you were. It could have been a new chapter in our relationship, but it was cut short by your friend. It was cut short because you were the Goblin, Harry snapped back at him. You threatened Mary Jane to get to Spider-Man, to get to the man who had declared himself to be my enemy. The Goblin existed only to destroy my enemies. Your enemies as well. The ones who would have taken all of this, Norman gestured around the mansion, away from you. They would have reduced us to poverty because they were jealous of us, Harry. They were jealous and seized with a sick need to destroy us. I was defending myself, defending you. No father could have done less. And Spider-Man sided with our enemies, and I died because of him. I died fighting for your future. Are you going to take that lying down? Norman drew closer, his voice more intense, his eyes almost hypnotic. See him in your mind's eye. That smug bastard. He took your girl, took your father, took your peace of mind. He keeps taking and taking. And haven't you had enough? For God's sake, haven't you had enough? Harry saw Mary Jane on a field of stars, singing of love, singing to Peter right there in the front row. He felt an acid taste in the back of his throat, and a thudding in his head and a buzzing in his ears. He had thought he could live with it. He had thought he could keep himself from acting upon this terrible knowledge. Because the knowledge of what he would have to become to combat it was almost as terrible. But seeing her tonight, seeing him, knowing what they were likely off doing now, Peter enjoying the life that should have been his. More than enough, grated Harry. That's my boy. Norman Osborn embraced him. He had no substance at all. Harry didn't care. He hugged him as hard as he'd always wished he had in life. Then Harry rose from his chair, guided by his father. He headed for the entrance to the lair, hidden by a full-length mirror that Harry had once shattered, then quickly replaced once he realized what was concealed behind there. He pushed the mirror aside and stepped through. The equipment beckoned to him, and he would heed the call, for the son could do no less for the father than he, the father, had done for him. Flint Marko, a.k.a. William Marko, a.k.a. William Baker, pressed himself flat against the alleyway nearby a row of rundown apartment houses. A police car was cruising by, and although Marko had fairly unremarkable features, light brown hair, a square jaw, the prison garb he was wearing would have been a dead giveaway. He was having trouble catching his breath, and wondered not for the first time if he was having a heart attack. Curiously, the thought of dropping dead in the alleyway wasn't all that disturbing to him. Flint Marko had lived his life in a way that didn't engender much love for his own existence, or much care as to whether he lived or died. A guy like Marko knew that when your number was up, there was no use whining about it. He remembered once, when he was young, seeing a big hourglass in a pawn shop. He had turned it over, watched the steady stream of sand as it filtered to the bottom, then reversed it just before the sand had completely run through. Then he'd watched as it fell through the other way, then again and again, turning it over and over, until his mother was done hawking her wedding jewelry and informed her son that it was time to leave. He had found it frustrating, because he'd felt as if he were in competition with the sand, and if the sand made it all through to the other side, he was going to lose. Defiantly, he laid the hourglass on its side, in hopes of thwarting the sand. The hourglass had rolled off the table and crashed to the ground, spreading sand everywhere. The angry shopkeeper had demanded compensation, taking back just about all the money he'd given to Flint's mother, and young Flint had gotten an earful and a good beating when he got home. It had been a hard-learned lesson. The sand always wins, because the sand represents time, and nothing can stop time from passing. But he'd be damned if he was going to spend any more of his passing time in the custody of New York State, that was for sure. He was clutching a stack of letters to his chest, held together by a rubber band. The edges of some of the envelopes were battered, and the ink was smeared on a few of them. Closer inspection would have revealed the words, "Delivery refused, return to sender," stamped on the front of every single envelope. Marko hugged the shadows, not wanting to make the slightest move until he was certain the police car was long gone. Once he was satisfied that, for the moment, he was safe, he made his way over to a familiar fire escape. The ladder was above his reach. He glanced around and found a length of frayed, discarded rope nearby amidst the rest of the garbage in the alley. It wasn't much, but it would serve his purposes. He tied the end of the rope around the packet of letters, then tossed the letters upward. He missed the first time, but the second time, the packet swung up and over the lower rung and dropped halfway down again. Marko reached up, now able to grip both ends of the rope, and pulled down as hard as he could. The ladder resisted at first, then gave up and slid noisily down toward him. The racket caused Marko to step back into the shadows, to wait for a reaction from anyone. But there was nothing. No response at all from any of the windows above. He supposed that shouldn't have been a surprise. This was New York, the city where, years ago, several buildings worth of people had turned away and done nothing, not even call the cops, while a young woman was brutally murdered, screaming for help the entire time. If cries for succor wasn't sufficient to get the neighbors interested, certainly the creaking of a fire escape ladder wasn't going to prompt any involvement. He scrambled up the ladder like a monkey on a mission, and, moments later, was clambering up the fire escape. He was doing so as quietly as he could. No use tempting fate by counting too heavily on the perceived apathy of New Yorkers. Marko drew close to a familiar window, and briefly considered the possibility that the people supposedly living within had moved. Why not? He'd have no way of knowing. No one ever came to visit him in prison. And with his letters returned, who was to say that they weren't currently residing in New Jersey, or Connecticut, or outer Mongolia? Peering into the darkened room, he saw someone asleep in the bed, and for a moment his worst fears were realized. It wasn't Penny. It couldn't be. Penny was much smaller than this child. But then he recognized the array of medicines upon her night table, and the snow globe he'd gotten her for her 5th birthday, and his concerns were eased. He even took a moment to appreciate the humor of the situation, that he had been thrown off by the simple fact that Penny had grown. Well, of course, he'd been in jail for 18 months. Flint slid open the window and eased himself into the room. He almost tripped over a doll she'd left on the floor. Cautiously, he picked it up, praying it wouldn't make any noise, and placed it on a chair. Marko moved like a thief in the night, except he was dropping off rather than taking away. It was a reckless indulgence, but he leaned down and kissed his sleeping daughter anyway on the top of her brunette head. She didn't stir. A bit more boldly, but still being careful, he eased the stack of letters under her pillow. There. That way Penny would be sure to see them in the morning, provided other people didn't stumble over them first. He paused by the snow globe and picked it up. He recalled when he'd first found it in a curio shop, with its tiny castle surrounded by swirling snow. He remembered imagining Penny's delightful reaction, and hadn't been disappointed. She had clapped her hands with glee and thanked her father profusely. Even Emma had smiled, and that wasn't something she did easily in those days, and admittedly probably even less these days. Marko made his way carefully out into the living room. His old trunk was there, right where he'd left it. He opened it slowly, so as not to cause the hinges to creak. Just as he'd figured, all his clothes had been stuffed into it. Emma had cleared out his closet and his drawers. He supposed that shouldn't have been too much of a surprise. Perhaps he should have been relieved she hadn't donated them all to Goodwill. Quickly, he doffed the clothes he'd been wearing and pulled on a pair of dark trousers and a black and green striped sweater. He kept the shoes he'd been wearing. Then he moved quickly to the kitchen, desperate to fulfill the craving for food at the pit of his stomach. He felt like a trapped animal, and every bit the loser that his wife had pronounced him to be. Emma had made it clear that she wanted Flint out of her and Penny's lives. But how could she say that? Didn't she understand what he was capable of doing to help? Some freaking compassion was all he was looking for, some acknowledgement that he was just doing the best he could to help. Doing the best one could had to count for something. Why couldn't she just... The kitchen light snapped on. Flint turned and froze, as if the beam of light had lanced through him. The bread was still in his mouth as he found himself staring into the startled face of Emma Marko. Then the expression of surprise faded, replaced by a total lack of surprise, as if she'd expected that. Sooner or later, he'd show up at their apartment, desperate and on the run like an idiot. Being a well-meaning idiot didn't earn him a lot of cred from her these days. He opened his mouth slightly and allowed the bread to drop into his open hand. Flint both looked and felt foolish. The weight of their mutual history settled between them like a vast invisible barrier. Without the slightest indication that she was at all curious how he'd managed to break out. Perhaps she'd read about Marko having slipped away when a fight had broken out among fellow convicts during an enforced outing to clean up local highways. Or what it was he wanted or hoped to achieve in having coming here. Emma briskly said, "You can't hide here, Flint." Her hair prematurely graying, her face careworn, both of which Marko blamed himself for. Emma drew her ratty pink bathrobe more tightly around herself, as if that would protect her should he choose to attack her. Ultimately, Flint Marko decided that, Despite the dire situation, he need not forsake at least the slightest indication of respect, and even, dare he say it, affection. Pulling together what little charm he had left, Marko forced a smile and said, "How are you, Emma?" She looked as if she wanted to laugh at the question. Obviously, she considered it ludicrous. "How does it look how Emma is?" she demanded. She gestured broadly, trying to encompass the entirety of her miserable life. "She's on welfare and got no insurance. And we have this beautiful furniture," she added sarcastically. She shook her head, and in a fairly decent impression of his deep growling voice, mimicked, "How are you, Emma?" She was trying to put him on the defensive. She was lashing out, and he had to keep reminding himself not to react in anger. In truth, she had every reason to be pissed off at him. He'd brought all of this down on them. Granted, he had just been trying to help. In the end, though, what difference did that make? He was still a lousy con on the run. Penny was still sick, and Emma's life was still in the toilet. Intentions didn't mean a damn. Only results mattered. "I'm just here to see my daughter," he said, forcing himself to keep his voice calm and even. "You're an escaped convict," she snapped. "The cops are looking for you. You're not getting near her. You're nothing but a common thief. And you maybe even killed a man?" "No, Marko could feel his self-control slipping. Emma sensed it, and perhaps worried that she pushed him too far, took a defensive step back. He took in a deep breath, let it out, and regained control. "It wasn't like that. I had good reason for what I was doing, and that's the truth." He knew it was futile. She didn't care about the truth. She didn't care about him. "You and the truth sitting in prison having 3 meals a day," she sneered. Her face was so twisted in fury it was hard for Marko to believe that she had ever loved him. How was it possible for someone to change that much? "You want to talk truth? I live in the presence of great truth. That's the truth that you left behind." She pointed towards Penny's door. "Right there in that bedroom." Flint reflexively looked in the direction that Emma was pointing, and was startled to see Penny's limpid eyes peering at him from the narrow opening in the doorframe. He could see that she was clutching the packet of letters to her chest. He could see the recognition dawning in her eyes, and the indisputable look of pleasure upon seeing him. "Let Emma scream at me. Let her vent. Let her blame me for everything. Ain't nothing she can say that one smile from Penny can't turn right around." Emma was still yelling at him, but now Flint was ignoring her. Instead, he took a step toward the bedroom. Tossing aside hesitation, Penny threw wide the door, and her smile broadened. At first, Emma didn't see her because Marko had stepped into her line of vision as he faced his daughter. Then he knelt down in front of her, like a humble supplicant, and whispered, "Your mother's got me all wrong. I do care about you." Penny's smile was incandescent, and Flint felt her press something small into his palm. He looked down at it, and was surprised to see a small locket. He was so taken by the gesture that he actually forgot that Emma was in the room, but was reminded harshly enough when she shrieked in fury and came right at him. She was acting as if he were some sort of monster or child molester or anything but what he truly was. A loving father stealing a few seconds of affection from his daughter. "You get out of here, now!" Emma bellowed, and she shoved Flint hard. Because he was crouched and she was standing over him, she came close to knocking him to the floor. Flint stopped his fall with an outstretched hand and clambered to his feet. Emma aimed a kick at him and missed. Penny looked terrified. The irony was not lost on Marko. Here Emma thought she was protecting her daughter, and all she was really accomplishing was scaring the crap out of her. "Out of my life, out of my daughter's life. Always hiding, climbing in and out of the windows. Look at you. Never having the pleasure of knocking on a front door. Now get out!" For a fleeting moment, he considered punching her in the face, breaking her teeth. At least that would get her to shut up for a short time so he could have a few seconds to think. But it went against the grain. And besides, it would just alarm Penny. Plus, Emma would use that as an example for the rest of Penny's life as to why her dad was a bad, evil man. Then the entire matter of staying became moot when Marko heard the distant sound of a siren. It might not have anything to do with him. Might be a fire or some police activity nearby. On the other hand, it might also be that a neighbor had spotted him and called the cops. He couldn't take the chance. Quickly, he headed for the window. He put one leg over the sill, turned, and said in a final endeavor to gain sympathy, "I'm not a bad person. Just had bad luck." Emma displayed about as much compassion as he had expected. None. "There you go," she remarked, as if everything she just said was supported by his exit. Out another window. "Pray for me," he called as he exited the apartment. He stood on the fire escape, out of sight of the apartment's interior. From within, he could hear Emma attempting to console Penny. Except, curiously, Penny didn't sound at all upset. Emma was the one who sounded as if she needed consoling. There was none of the furious bravado or anger that had been present when she'd been talking to him. Instead, she just sounded sad. He heard Penny say, "I think he was going to cry, Mama." Perceptive kid. Marko blinked his eyes hard, trying to get the last of the tears out of the way. "He always cried," Emma told her. That much was true as well. He'd cried when they'd married, when Penny was born, when Penny was diagnosed, when he'd been dragged away to prison. Emma had always been the strong one, and had resented the hell out of him for that. "I gotta be strong," he thought grimly. "For Emma, for Penny, hell, for myself. I've got to get the job done, because nobody else can and nobody else cares. God, the things fathers do for their kids." With that resolve thundering in his thoughts, Flint Marko slid down the fire escape ladder and vanished into the night. The small room was alive with the sound of hissing gas. An assortment of green goblin masks looked on. Sort of looked on from the wall, watching in mute approval. Their attention, such as it was focused on the clear, enclosed chamber at the far end of the room. Like a poisonous emerald snake, the green gas continued to fill up the chamber. The swirling gas obscured the naked figure within, which was writhing and twisting in torment. "For you, Dad. It's for you. I'm doing it for you. I never wanted this. It hurts so much. But it's for you. For you. Just please be proud of me. Be proud." Then the agony became too much for Harry Osborn. He thought he was going to die, and right at that moment he would have welcomed death's release. Just as he reached his breaking point, the gas began to dissipate. It didn't register upon Harry at first that it was over, that he had survived. In fact, when the pressure doors whooshed open, it still took him a few minutes to process exactly what happened. Even then, he didn't immediately step forward. Even though he was alone in his father's lair, Harry felt incredibly suspicious, as if the entire world were lying in wait just outside and preparing to pounce upon him. Then the suspicion started to clear away, to be replaced by a smug, arrogant defiance. Let them be waiting. Let them all be waiting. He would be able to dispose of them with absolutely no problem. Nothing could conceivably pose a serious threat to him. Nothing except the traitorous bastard who had killed his father. Harry Osborn was going to make sure that that didn't remain a consideration for much longer. Deep within his brain, in the small piece of gray matter that was watching the proceedings like a hog-tied passenger shoved into the back of an out-of-control bus, Harry shied away in horror over what he had become, and the forces that had compelled him down the same destructive road that his predecessor had trod. The things kids do for their fathers, he thought grimly. And then, for no reason, that suddenly struck him as funny. He started to laugh, a maniacal cackle that continued loud and long and out of control. And soon, Harry Osborn was out of control as well. 3. The best laid plans. Peter knew it was an insane time to visit his Aunt May, but he also knew what he wanted to do regarding Mary Jane, and he was convinced that if he didn't discuss it with someone, then his resolve might wither and fade with the coming of the morning sun. If, on the other hand, he discussed it with Aunt May, then he would have voiced the decision that was rattling around in his brain. Speaking would give it life that might well outlast the dawn. Besides, how could he be thinking about committing himself fully to Mary Jane if he couldn't even commit himself fully to the idea to begin with? So it was that he rolled up to May Parker's apartment on his motor scooter at an ungodly hour, when the entire Queens neighborhood was sound asleep. Cautious as ever, certain he was unobserved, he picked up the scooter as if it weighed nothing and carried it through the front entrance of the apartment building. There he rested it against a wall, while he found Aunt May's doorbell on the residence list. He hated that she'd have to move out of the old house in Forest Hills. Bad enough that, thanks to him, his Uncle Ben had been murdered by a two-bit thief that he, Peter, could have stopped well before the fatal incident. Because of that, May had wound up in dire financial straits, forced to sell the place that had been her home for as long as Peter could remember. She acted as if it were a blessing. "How long was I supposed to patter around in the empty house?" she said at the time. "It deserves a young family just starting life, not an old woman whose family years are behind her." Peter never answered her, suspecting the question was rhetorical. But he felt a touch of melancholy just the same, and sometimes wondered if there was ever going to be an end to the things over which he felt guilty. Aunt May had forgiven him for his admission that he had had some culpability in his uncle's violent passing, although, naturally, he had left out the more incriminating aspects of the tale. When was he going to forgive himself? He pushed the doorbell of Aunt May's apartment and silently promised to focus on more positive things for the time being. May Parker was startled out of her slumber by the urgent ringing of her apartment buzzer. She squinted in the darkness, disoriented, and was startled to see that the glowing numbers of the digital clock on her nightstand read 2:00 a.m. Her natural assumption was that someone had died. Why else would she be woken up at this hour? She got out of bed, tossed on a robe, shoved her feet into the bunny slippers that Peter had gotten her for her last birthday, and made her way to the intercom. She banged one shin on the coffee table as she did so, and swore in a way that would have prompted her to scold her nephew fiercely if he had uttered the same word. But she figured that if one had lived as long as she had, one was entitled to a few allowances. Nursing her sore leg, she limped the rest of the way to the distance to the intercom, and tapped the button. "Who is it?" she asked, fully expecting it to be some drunken idiot pushing the wrong button. To her astonishment, a familiar voice said, "Peter." "Peter?" Immediately she buzzed him in, then steeled herself for whatever disastrous news he had. It had to be simply catastrophic. He was dying. Mary Jane was dying, or already dead. There was a knock at the door. Although she assumed it was Peter, May still peered quickly through the peephole. There he was, holding his motorcycle, helmet, and backpack. He looked concerned but determined. Prepared for the worst, she threw open the door and waited, holding her breath. A grin split Peter's face. "I've decided to marry Mary Jane." May thought she was going to pass out, not from being overwhelmed by Peter's announcement, but from relief that all her worst-case scenarios were without foundation. Then, ever so briefly, she considered smacking Peter upside the head for scaring the living daylights out of her at 2 a.m. Out of her boundless love and forgiveness, she did not do so. "Oh my," she managed. And then, when nothing else came to her because her mind was still processing the information and banishing images of funerals, she fell back onto her default response to any startling news. "This calls for a cup of tea." Any hesitancy or remorse Peter had felt over rousing Aunt May from her slumber instantly dissipated when he saw how genuinely happy she was for him. As he sat at her kitchen table sipping tea, he chatted about how much Mary Jane meant to him, how his life somehow just made more sense when she was a part of it. It wasn't just for May's benefit in understanding his elation. It was for his own as well. Even now, he was still talking himself into taking the big step, and he figured that if there was any fault in either his logic or emotions, Aunt May would point it out. "You're too young," or "Are you sure you've considered all the ramifications?" Or other similar helpful bromides would undoubtedly fall from her lips if she had any concern over Peter's course. If Aunt May sensed Peter's nagging second thoughts, or if she did really believe it was the wrong move, she said nothing to that effect. Instead, she continued to smile and listen attentively. She yawned once or twice, discreetly covering it with the back of her hand. Peter chalked that up to her being so interested in what he was saying that she was making the effort to stay awake. After all, scientifically, that's what yawning was. The body's attempt to intake a sizable portion of oxygen all at once to refresh the brain, lest fatigue set in. Peter felt that no one should ever be insulted if someone yawned in his or her presence. It's actually a compliment. It meant one was worth the effort of trying to stay awake for, as opposed to nodding off. Peter finally ran out of things to say and realized that he had presented his case. He paused, waiting for Aunt May's opinion. She added a bit more hot water to refresh her tea, then stirred it thoughtfully, composing her thoughts. Then, as if her mind were a million miles away, she looked at the engagement ring on her finger and smiled wistfully. "You know, the day your Uncle Ben asked me to marry him, we were both scared and excited, and," she laughed at the recollection, "very young. And I loved him so fiercely." She added that last with a touch of fiery pride. "And you said yes, right?" "No," she replied, which startled Peter. "I wanted to say yes, but I said no. I wasn't ready, and neither was he. So, we took our time, looked forward to it. Didn't want to run into something with nothing to count on but love." She rested a liver-spotted hand atop his, and said gently, as if delivering bad news that he wouldn't want to hear, "Love is not enough, Peter. There's so much more beyond it that has to be considered." "Come on," he said with an uncomfortable laugh. "I know that. When Uncle Ben and I were married, we had a little more security." So that's what this was about. Here all of his concerns and doubts stemmed from uncertainty over his feelings. Trust Aunt May to approach the question from the most pragmatic aspects. "I have security. I have a job," he reminded her. "You need a steady job, with benefits." He had to admit that much was true. There were wider aspects to consider. If Peter was single, whatever happened to him was really his own lookout. If he was married, then his problems became Mary Jane's problems. What if he was seriously injured in a battle? A broken limb? A stray bullet that got lucky? Yes, he healed quickly, but you couldn't heal a bullet. He couldn't be in need of hospitalization or a doctor's care and have no medical insurance. Plus, what about more everyday considerations? What if they were married and Mary Jane became pregnant? It could happen. Happened every day. The cost of a pregnancy and hospital stay without medical coverage, it could break them. Would break them. As all this raced through his mind, Aunt May looked fixedly into his eyes and continued, "A husband has to be understanding and put his wife before himself. Can you do that, Peter?" With this question, at least, Peter felt confident. "Of course I can," he said with utter conviction. She smiled. Apparently, as far as Aunt May was concerned, if Peter was on solid ground with that aspect of it, everything else would fall into place. "Then you have my blessing," she said, and he hadn't realized until that moment he was actually looking for it. Once she gave it, though, it felt right. It felt good. "And," she said, "I hope you've considered a proper proposal." Again, she looked at her engagement ring, reminiscing. And when she spoke, she could have been describing something that had transpired just yesterday. "Uncle Ben had it all planned. We went for a walk, and he laid me down under a juniper tree. And he said," she paused, then deepened her voice to sound like Ben's, "Close your eyes and make a wish." She chuckled and continued, "And I did. And he said, 'Open them.' And I did. And he was holding this ring. It wasn't especially large. Quite the opposite, actually. Then again, May Parker was never the showiest of women, and would have considered a large gleaming rock too gaudy. Plus, it was given to her by Ben probably made it huge in her eyes. This ring, dazzling in front of me. I thought it was the sun." She looked at it with a trace of sadness. "We'd be married 50 years, come August, if someone hadn't been..." Her voice dropped, and in a husky tone, clearly trying to compose herself, she sighed, "Oh, God," as if annoyed with her own weakness. She clenched her hand into a fist, then let out a soft sigh like a cleansing breath. "So," she said, "make it very special for that lovely girl. Do something she'll never forget." She hesitated only for an instant. Then she pulled the engagement ring from her finger and held it out to Peter. "And give her this." Peter was stunned by the generosity. His instinct was to protest, to say that he couldn't. How could he possibly take one of her fondest memories of Uncle Ben? Then he realized that, with or without the ring on her finger, the memory would remain intact. Furthermore, if Peter had learned one thing in his life, it was never to argue with May Parker when she had a particularly determined look on her face, as she did now. Giving in to the inevitable, he took the ring from her with great care, and in a hushed tone said, "Thank you, Aunt May." She nodded once, the deal sealed, and then her eyes sagged slightly. She pulled herself back from fatigue and said, "It's late. You better go on home." Peter gathered up his things as May cleared the china from the kitchen table. As he headed for the front door, Peter's gaze fell upon the old, small, uptight piano near the wall. He remembered with great amusement all the times that, in his youth, Aunt May had sat with him and forced him to practice. She had disdained the need for a piano teacher. "Why spend good money to have someone teach him something that I already know?" she had sniffed whenever Ben had suggested someone else be brought in to show Peter the ropes. Peter had come to despise the instrument, far preferring to stay up in his room and read his books, since he knew he was good at that. Now, though, as an adult, he had come to appreciate May's intentions to widen his horizons. As a gesture of appreciation, he slid onto the piano bench, sat with his fingers poised over the keys, called up the strains of Debussy's Clair de Lune from those long-ago lessons, and started to play. It was uninspiring. Frighteningly enough, Peter remembered Clair de Lune as one of his stronger pieces, so he shuddered to think what the William Tell overture must have sounded like to adult ears. As it was, he stumbled through the first few bars as best he could. Aunt May kept a smile plastered on her face, but he could see her eyes wincing with every misplayed note, of which there were more than a few. Peter's musical effort was mercifully cut short by an irritated banging on the floor from the poor devil living underneath, who didn't apparently feel like being serenaded badly at whatever time in the morning it was. Pulling his hands away from the keyboard as if it had caught fire, Peter said in a lame attempt at self-defense, "Needs tuning." Aunt May grinned as she held the door open for him. Peter pulled his helmet on and she patted him on the arm as he passed. "After you're married, feel free to visit me. Only come a little earlier." He hugged his beloved aunt, the woman who had raised him, and headed out the door, feeling far lighter in spirit than he had in weeks. The feeling stayed with him all the way back to his Manhattan apartment. Though naturally he was paying attention to the road the entire ride, he was still unaware of the passage of time. His mind was awhirl with images of Mary Jane accepting his proposal, of their marriage, honeymooning, having children, growing old together. He savored every one. Life was good. Almost too good, his ever-sour subconscious warned him. But he dismissed that kind of thinking. As he pulled his bike up to his apartment building, killing the motor, he decided that he was going to embrace the power of positive thinking. Perhaps things went wrong because he expected the worst-case scenario at any moment. He had even temporarily lost his powers because of his uncertainty and lack of desire to live up to his responsibilities. There was no reason that he couldn't shape his life to be as positive as he wanted it to be simply by being determined to make it happen. He stepped off the bike, removed his helmet, and checked his watch. 4 a.m. He didn't feel at all tired. Perhaps he should do some web swinging to... Nah, how about something normal for once? Drink a glass of milk, watch TV, or read a book till your eyes get heavy? Something like that. You have been prioritizing Peter Parker's life for once, and that's been going pretty well for you. Smartest thing would be to keep doing exactly what you're doing, and not switch over to His spider sense went off. He acted completely on instinct, as he always did in such matters. He leapt towards the building, figuring to hit the wall and scurry up it, by a few precious seconds, get a clearer idea of what was happening and where it was coming from. It was one of the rare instances when his instincts betrayed him. Airborne as he was, he had no protection, no recourse, as something slammed into him. The ground spun away from Peter with dizzying speed as he arced upward, heading towards the stars that he had been admiring from a distance only a few hours before. He twisted around, trying to see who or what had grabbed him. He heard the high-pitched whine of a powerful engine, and suddenly found himself staring, not into a person's face, but into a demented-looking and high-tech, almost familiar mask, covering the lower part of his attacker's head. The Goblin? The Green Goblin? But he's dead! I saw him die! Am I dreaming? Did I fall asleep? Am I still in the web hammock with MJ and I drifted off? This can't... The buildings were a blur beneath him as Peter, an unwilling passenger, continued to angle sharply upward. This new Goblin grabbed Peter by the hair, yanking his head back. Peter gasped, trying to comprehend what was happening, with the sharp pain and the stinging feel of the wind in his face reinforcing that this was no dream. The new Goblin drew his free arm back, ready to strike, and fearsome blades sprouted from the wrist of his armor. As Peter tried to pull away, but he had no leverage. Snagged as he was, immobilized as he was, Peter couldn't offer more than token resistance as the blade sliced across his chest. It shredded his shirt, raising a thin line of blood, and he cried out in agony. If he hadn't managed to pull back even the marginal amount that he had, it would have ripped open his torso. The Goblin repositioned himself and tried to bring the blades around again, but the pain galvanized Peter. He snagged the Goblin's arm, strength against strength, holding the lethal weapon at bay. The Goblin was cackling dementedly, but there was a slight hesitation, the briefest uncertainty. Grabbing the opportunity to do some damage, Peter swung his foot up and kicked the Goblin hard in the chest. The Goblin lost his grip on Peter's hair, although Peter was certain he felt some strands pulling loose from his scalp. Peter twisted clear and flipped himself over the Goblin's head. He let himself go into freefall just to get some distance. He afforded a fast glance behind him and saw that the Goblin was astride a different vehicle than he had been last time. It wasn't a bat-winged glider, but instead something that looked more like a supercharged high-tech snowboard. The armor was also different, far more minimal, a few pieces slapped together. Peter kept his arms and legs straight and dove like a parachutist. The ground spun below him, but he had been in far more dizzying circumstances than this. In fact, the effect was almost calming. The first chance he had to compose his thoughts since this unwarranted, insane attack had begun. Obviously, whoever his assailant was, this new goblin knew that Peter was Spider-Man. His secret identity was blown. At the moment, though, his biggest worry was not getting killed. Everything else could just wait. Believing he'd managed to put enough distance between him and his attacker, Peter fired a web line and snagged a nearby building. He started to swing toward it. Then his heart fell as he saw the goblin swoop down near the adhesion point of the webbing to the building. Then the rest of him fell along with his heart as the goblin sliced through the webbing with one fast flick of his blades. Cut loose from his momentary salvation, Peter started to fall again, tumbling out of control. Knowing that the goblin could keep repeating that trick, that he could follow Peter all the way down, cutting through web lines until he was out of building and out of time, he didn't have any other choice, and so brought his arm up to fire yet another web line. He didn't even get the shot off. His spider sense warned him, but he couldn't do a damn thing about it as the goblin slammed into him, sending him tumbling literally heels over head and crashing into the side of a nearby skyscraper. If it had at least been glass, Peter could have smashed through it and perhaps escaped to the inside. No such luck. Instead, he impacted with solid brick and mortar, embedding the left side of his body into the side of the building. Peter knew he could pull free, but it was going to take him a few moments to extricate himself. The goblin soared down toward him, and Peter wondered if he was going to have even those precious few seconds. If the goblin came in hurtling a pumpkin grenade, or swinging his blades, But he didn't. The goblin slowed and then stopped, hovering nearby. The move surprised Peter. The goblin had him cold, but he wasn't pressing the advantage. Why? Did he want to toy with him? Convinced that Peter couldn't get away, was he determined to make Peter suffer? Or was it that he was reluctant to make the final move because it seemed Peter was a goner? If it was the latter, if the goblin was conflicted, it couldn't be. Of course it had to be. There was no one else. As if intuiting what was going through Peter's mind, the goblin touched some sort of mechanism in the palm of his gloved hand. The mask slid back, and the coldly furious face of Harry Osborn glared at him. "Harry," Peter whispered. Inwardly, he wasn't surprised. He'd figured it out. Knowing it, however, wasn't the same as being confronted by the harsh reality. "You knew this was coming, Pete." The friendly nickname sounded like an obscenity on his lips. Harry abruptly angled the sky stick forward, slamming his fist at Peter in one rapid motion. Peter barely managed to yank his arm clear. He heard and felt a tearing of cloth, and part of his jacket sleeve was left behind, but better ripped clothing than a shattered face. Leaping aside, Peter just avoided Harry's punch, which smashed brick and crumbled some of the mortar to dust. Peter, landing on another section of the wall some feet away, gaped at the destruction. Whatever Norman Osborn had done to himself to acquire accelerated strength, Harry had clearly done it as well, and the action had muddled Harry's mind just as it had Norman's. Or perhaps not. It might have been wishful thinking, but it still seemed to Peter as if Harry was moving slowly, hesitating at key moments, reluctant to deliver a final lethal blow. Holding out a slender thread of hope that his erstwhile friend could be reasoned with, Peter called out to him, "He was trying to kill me! He killed himself! Shut up!" Harry shoved his hands into the section of the broken wall that Peter was still perched upon and ripped it clear of the building. Peter went flying, his arms pinwheeling, his jacket flapping wide. Aunt May's engagement ring flew out of his pocket. It was the merest luck that his peripheral vision noticed it, glinting in the night. He twisted around in midair, grasping at it. Ironically, it was the only thing that saved him. because Harry dive-bombed right where Peter would have been had he been trying to get back to the wall. But Peter was moving in a completely different direction, toward the tumbling ring, and so Harry missed him clean. Peter desperately fired a web line at the diamond ring, as accurately as he typically was. Because both he and the ring were falling and it was so small a target, the web line whizzed a fraction of an inch to the side of the ring. "Don't take your eyes off it! Don't!" As if he were swimming through air, Peter lunged towards the ring, oblivious to all else. This time, it cost him. Harry sped down toward him and sideswiped him hard. Peter was knocked violently to one side. He was completely disoriented, with no idea which way was up or down. A dozen different tactics ran through his brain like a computer sucking down data, and none of them seemed as if it would work. Despair seized him, and then he slammed into another building. His arm went out instinctively to break the fall. Even then, it only partially shielded his head. He cracked his skull, and was positive that he could actually hear his brain sloshing around inside his cranium. Blackness started to envelop him. For the first time since this had begun, possibly for the first time since he had acquired his spider powers, Peter Parker was seized with the belief that he was going to die. His life flashed before his eyes, and then everything went dark. 4. The Longest Night, Part 1. The rushing of air past Peter's face roused him to the outer fringes of consciousness. He hadn't recovered enough to completely register what was happening, but he reacted with desperate reflex. He twisted around and blindly fired a web line. He had absolutely no idea which way he was shooting it, and no clue how close to the ground he was. If the webbing went straight up, he was a dead man. For the first time since the assault began, Peter's luck held up. His webbing snagged something. He didn't know what it was, but as long as it wasn't moving, that was good enough for him. From high above, he heard a roar of disapproval. The Goblin had apparently been watching his descent, satisfied to observe Peter's final splat from a distance. So Peter was actually far enough away that the Goblin didn't have an opportunity to cut the web line. Peter snapped back upward like a bungee jumper, and as his vision cleared, he saw that the web line had snagged on the stone gargoyle perched atop a corner of the building. He landed on the ledge and held on to the gargoyle for a moment, steadying himself. Then he remembered the ring. Desperately looking around, stretching his already heightened senses to their limits, he spotted it. 10 stories below, the glittering ring ricocheted off a parked car with a hollow tink, bounced into the street, and tumbled straight toward a sewer grating. Oh God, no, please God, no, not that! Shoving his back against the wall for balance, he fired webbing from both arms of the grating. The webbing sprayed out across it, completely covering the openings. Seconds later, the diamond ring rolled onto the grating but came to a halt, ensnared in the webbing. Peter let out a sigh of relief, but he had no time to dwell on his brief triumph. The Goblin was diving down toward him, a pumpkin bomb in his hand. He threw it, and Peter leapt clear of the building side. The bomb slammed into the gargoyle and blew it off the ledge, sending the entire statue hurtling toward the ground. Seizing the opportunity, Peter landed a short distance away even as he fired a web line, snagging the gargoyle. He swung his arm, whipping the statue around. Perfect timing. Harry had wrongly assumed that Peter was going to prevent the gargoyle from falling to the street. Instead, Peter snapped the statue around as if it were a mace and sent it slamming into the Goblin with such force that it caused him to lose control of the sky stick. Harry pinwheeled across the Manhattan skyline, howling with fury. Still holding the web line, Peter swung the statue up in a smooth arc that sent it tumbling onto the roof overhead. He then released it and skittered to the ground, moving with reckless speed. Peter hit the street, still running, stumbled for a second, then righted himself and sprinted toward the sewer grating. He plucked the precious ring from the webbing, shoved it in his pants pocket, and then, for good measure, webbed the pocket shut. Peter looked around to figure out where the hell he was, and realized that the battle had carried them many blocks south into Chinatown. For some reason, a Woody Allen comment crossed his mind. I'm astounded by people who want to know the universe when it's hard enough to find your way around Chinatown. Chinatown was an endless maze of narrow streets and alleyways. Peter had gotten lost there on 2 separate occasions, and had always considered it one of the perks of his powers to be capable of swinging above Chinatown and not have to worry about it anymore. That wasn't possible now, as the cackling of the goblin informed him. Harry had obviously pulled out of his tailspin, descending toward Peter at high speed. It was a blessing to be here. In the open space, bounding between buildings, Peter had had no chance. The goblin, Harry, damn it, it's Harry! Stop thinking of him as the goblin! Had all the room to maneuver and could hammer him relentlessly, while Peter had nowhere to hide and no means of avoiding the streets except through healthy dollops of luck. Down here, though, in the confines of Chinatown, his agility and quick thinking might give him the edge he sought. At least, that was the theory. Knowing that his life depended on his being right, Peter vaulted into the nearest alleyway and started running down it. For a moment, he wondered if Harry would figure out what his strategy was and refuse to be drawn into it. He needn't have worried. Without hesitation, Harry descended into the alleyway on his sky stick and went in pursuit of his best friend. "You can run, Pete, but you can't hide," Harry crowed and laughed once more. The alley couldn't have been more than 4 feet wide. Harry ran as fast as he could, his heart pounding against his chest. Harry stayed right on him, never more than a few yards back. Peter's spider sense managed to give him a head, but just barely. He moved right, left, never slowing, vaulting over garbage dumps, trash heaps, and the occasional unconscious drunk. Peter cut a corner tight, entered a street that was as narrow as the alley he just left, and kept going. He ducked as a blast of concussive force seared the air over his head. Then the ground under his feet exploded, sending him flying and crashing through a storefront display window. Harry dove down toward Peter, his right fist crackling as it prepped another concussive blast. Peter seized a string of Chinese firecrackers from the ruined storefront display window and frantically threw them just as Harry unleashed another blast. It struck the firecrackers in midair, and the entire array exploded directly in front of him. Noise and great gouts of color erupted all around Harry, confusing him, causing him to roar in fury. Then Peter was off again. "You won't get away that easy, Pete," Harry shouted, and kept on coming. Peter sprinted down another alleyway, which connected to another and yet another. Harry didn't slow. In fact, he was gaining, and Peter was starting to get out of breath. His endurance was superhuman, but it wasn't infinite. A dumpster sat dead ahead. Peter grabbed hold of it as he passed by, turned fast, and with an impressive display of strength, sent the whole thing hurtling upward toward the goblin. Garbage and assorted decaying food filled the air, momentarily blinding Harry, and likely grossing him out a bit. Peter headed down yet another alleyway in this labyrinthian neighborhood, his mind racing, trying to come up with any more ideas as his energy flagged. He looked up. Clotheslines were strung above him. The upper section of the alleyway was going to be too difficult for Harry to maneuver, so he was going to fly low. Quickly, Peter fired his webbing at a spot about 5 feet overhead and affixed it to the wall opposite. He drew it taut, and in the darkness of the alley, the gossamer web strand practically disappeared. He heard Harry coming in fast, gunning the engine of the sky stick. Peter started running again. Harry had to see him make the trap work. Harry had to see him to make the trap work. Peter was halfway down the alley when Harry came roaring around the corner, practically a blur to Peter's eye. Without slowing, Harry sped down the alleyway toward Peter, holding a pumpkin bomb in one hand and announcing that this was it. Peter wasn't going to get away this time. Harry never came close to spotting the web line. He hit it at full speed, the webbing cutting across his chest. Harry was knocked clean off the sky stick. The device kept going, bereft of its operator. Seconds later, it crashed to the ground, tumbling several times before sputtering to a halt. Harry fared far worse. He bounded back with as much force as he'd expended when he hit the web line. Because it had taken him in his midsection, he flipped over and landed on the pavement head first. Peter gasped in horror. Yes, the armor would absorb some of the damage, but that was still Harry's body in there suffering the high-speed concussive impact. The human body could only take so much jolting around. A neck or back could easily snap, armored or not. Peter saw his friend lying in a heap on the ground, and to his own frustration, found himself hesitating. It could be a trick. Harry could be playing possum, lying there to draw him in close, biding his time for Peter to lean over him in concern. And then Harry could gut him, send his intestines spilling out into the alleyway, and laugh in glee at the stupid expression on Peter Parker's dying face. Peter's hesitation seemed to him to last an age. If that's how I die, then that's the way it goes. But I've got to see if he's all right. Disdaining caution, Peter vaulted to the fallen Harry and checked him over. No warning of imminent danger from his spider sense. Harry wasn't faking anything. Peter pulled the mask away and saw that Harry's eyes were closed, his face pale, a thin line of spittle trailing down the side of his face. "Harry?" he said, but didn't wait for a response. Yanking the gauntlet off, he checked Harry's pulse. Nothing. "Oh my God," he whispered, unable to believe it. There was no way Peter could endure the knowledge that he had killed his best friend and single-handedly put an end to the Osborn family line. He put his head to Harry's chest. Still nothing. The silence of the grave. "Oh my God! Harry!" There was no whispering it now. And even as Peter howled his dismay, he started pumping Harry's chest. He had never been more grateful for that course in CPR that he had taken at the Y some years ago. He had been driven by terrible concerns that he might find his aunt or uncle collapsed on the floor one day, and he wanted to be certain that he would know what to do. Of course, he could never have envisioned back before his life became the insane spectacle that it was today, the use to which he would be putting the training. Even as he applied the pressure to Harry's heart, Peter's mind was racing. First rule of an accident: don't move the victim. You could cause all manner of greater damage in doing so. But he didn't have a cell phone to call an ambulance, and even if he did, Peter didn't know where the hell he was. He couldn't begin to describe their location beyond somewhere in Chinatown. He thought he felt a stirring in Harry's chest, but he couldn't be certain. CPR was simply a stopgap to keep someone alive until the paramedics showed up. None were going to be coming in this case. At least, not in time. Seeing that he had no choice, Peter slung Harry over his shoulder in a fireman's carry. Taking 2 quick steps, he fired a webbing upward and bounded to the top of a building. He needed height. He needed to be able to see what was in the vicinity. The second he hit the roof, he fired another web line and started swinging. "Uptown! Head uptown!" he frantically told himself. He knew uptown better than he did downtown, and besides, downtown tended to be more deserted in this hour. Peter had never moved with less consideration for his own safety. Even with the web-slinging skills he had developed, swinging one-handed was remarkably dangerous. Rather than alternate arms, he would fire a web line, swing to its apex, release, fire another one, and keep moving. The advantage was that it resulted in great distance-eating arcs. The disadvantage was that if he miscalculated, he could wind up smeared all over a building or on the side of an ill-timed passing truck. As he swung, he scrambled to recall everything he'd read about brain damage that could set in from lack of oxygen. What was it? 3 minutes? 5 minutes? How long before irreparable harm was done? How long before, even if Harry were brought up back to full respiration, he would wind up being a vegetable? Peter spotted a huge red cross 6 blocks west. Instantly, he headed in that direction. Time had slowed to a crawl, even though he was moving faster than anything else in Manhattan. In seconds, he was within sight of the emergency room, taking only the time required to yank the rest of the Goblin armor off Harry. Thank heavens there was passable street clothes underneath. Peter just didn't feel the need to answer certain questions right then. Peter dropped to the street a block from the hospital and sprinted the rest of the way. He had no idea how much time had elapsed since Harry had been injured. He wasn't even sure if the tortured young man slung over his shoulder was still alive. But he had no choice. He couldn't let Harry die. And if, despite his best efforts, Harry didn't make it, don't think about it. You always get in trouble when you think about things. Just run. Running. You're good at that. He was moving so quickly that the automatic doors to the emergency room almost didn't open in time. Peter charged in, shouting for help, and a nurse and some guys in green shirts came running toward him. Part of him was surprised that it was really just like what one sees on television. Within seconds, Harry was being loaded onto a gurney and the doctors were doing triage. Peter was so numb that he didn't even remember Harry being lifted off his shoulder. He watched as they shoved the gurney through a large set of double doors. They were shouting complicated medical terms, all at the same time, and it was so fast and loud that Peter couldn't follow any of it. But none of it sounded good. He took a step toward Harry, and then his way was blocked by a doctor or orderly or paramedic or someone who was shouting into his face. "What happened? Tell us what happened." Peter said the first words that came to mind. "Hit and run." Miraculously, that seemed to satisfy the person who had been demanding answers. Either that, or Peter looked and sounded so much like someone in shock that they simply figured they weren't going to get any better answers out of him. In shock would have been the correct diagnosis for Peter. He was still processing that Harry had followed his father's path so completely, all driven by a desire to kill Peter, and hadn't quite made it to the notion that Harry might not survive the night. The inquiring someone had vanished, and Peter, moving like a sleepwalker or a man in a trance, walked through the double doors. Harry was lying on the gurney a few feet away. They had yanked out the defibrillator paddles from a crash cart and positioned them on Harry's chest. "Clear!" a doctor shouted. Verifying that no one was touching Harry's body, the doctor triggered the paddles and Harry's body violently spasmed. Peter watched, trying not to panic and not succeeding. "No response," said the nurse, checking the readings. "Recharge and go again," the doctor snapped. At that moment, someone noticed that Peter was standing in a restricted area, and two orderlies descended upon him. He offered no resistance as they pushed him from the room. The door swung shut, blocking his view of what was going on. He felt stricken and terrified and guilty, but not guilty because he had caused the injury that had landed Harry in the hospital. No, it was guilt because Harry knew Peter's secret. And if Harry died, then the secret died with him. The terrible truth was that Peter's life would be much easier if Harry Osborn died here in the emergency room. That realization produced not only guilt, but self-loathing. What kind of person was he? To dwell on the notion that someone's death would be personally convenient? The kind of person who's concerned about other people. What if Harry recovers and he decides the best way to get to you is through your loved ones? Why not? Norman figured out that I was enamored of Mary Jane and played upon that. If Harry dies... No! He's not going to die. Peter angrily cut himself off. He's going to make it. And we'll get it all worked out somehow. How? Somehow. Now shut up! He leaned against the wall, feeling as if his soul weighed 100 pounds. He glanced at the clock. Still well before dawn. Peter rubbed the bridge of his nose, fighting fatigue, and decided that this had to be the longest night of his life. He briefly wondered if anyone was having a worse night than he was. But his voice was slightly out of sync, like a badly dubbed film. And apparently he's meowing too. Opal, what are you doing here? What, you're gonna knock over my 3D printed stormtrooper bust? Hi, what are you doing? Hey, nope, don't do that. Stand by, folks. Let me just bookmark this. Opal, what are you doing? You just snuck in here again? Yeah, I know. You really like making your presence known. Want to say hi to the people at home? Okay, you've said your piece. Now please, go away. Want to jump on my bed? You thinking about it? Come on. Come on. Come on, you can do it. You can do it. Yay, she did it. Alright, where was I? Harry was going crazy. That's right.